Hi, everyone, and a very warm welcome to the podcast. I'm coming to you today from Rosie, the very old Shasta trailer. She is a 1959, and it's a beautiful day here on the mountain, but it is quite windy, so please excuse any wind noise. My last video had a bunch of it when I was out in the forest with Junebug. So I want to talk today about something that is very timely for me. I am about 30,000 words into a newish manuscript that I'm very excited about. I say new-ish because these were not a fast 30,000 words. I started working on this probably over a year ago, but I've recently picked it up again. I really like the story. I'm excited about the concept. This is likely a manuscript that I will pitch to agents at some point when it's done, hopefully next year, because I'm not a super fast writer. I'm also not a linear writer, what people sometimes call a plotter, right? We've heard, many of us, these terms, plotter and pantser. I've talked about these elsewhere on the channel. So a plotter is essentially, let's say you're a pure plotter. I think most writers are a combination of the two. A plotter is someone who is very meticulous about outlining, for example, or listing, or doing all of their research ahead of time before even writing a word. They really have their ducks in a row as far as the organization of a manuscript. They know beginning, middle, end. They have a sense of the story arc. And again, they're usually doing some sort of pre-writing, we might call it, where they're outlining or charting or graphing or any and all of the above, and some others too. A pantser, on the other hand, is someone who kind of goes by the seat of their pants, that old saying, right? Someone who just sort of makes it up as they go along. So a pure pantser might look like someone who just has some kind of an idea or hears a snippet of a conversation and just starts writing what they heard. Maybe they do some free writing. Maybe the first draft looks like free writing, which is just tends to be sort of stream of consciousness, disorganized. It could almost seem like rambling, right? But it's a way of getting the content down, getting the ideas down, getting the sort of the feel and the voice and the tone of the manuscript down. There's a lot of different ways to go about that, because especially if you are a pantser, boy, there are probably as many different techniques for, I don't want to say pantsing, writing as a pantser, that there are writers who sort of relate to this style. So I would put myself kind of somewhere in the middle zone between the two. Again, I think this is pretty common. I think it's rare to find someone who is just a pure plotter, because honestly, I think there's a rigidity there if you are just never letting yourself just brainstorm or play with the story a little bit. If you're always just very, very regimented about it, I would imagine, again, I don't know from personal experience, but I would imagine that the end result might also feel pretty regimented. And if it's fiction or something adjacent to fiction, it could be a stylistic choice, I guess, to be extremely regimented, but maybe flow would be lacking, a certain creative spark. I've talked about the creative spark recently too. Whereas if, let's say you are purely, I'm just making up these sort of hypothetical, pure one or the other people, very sort of polarized. If you're purely a pantser type of writer and you publish something that stems from that, you really haven't put a lot of structure to it, you're sort of going to be on the other side of the spectrum, which would be the end result, I would imagine, could be very disjointed, hard to follow. Again, this can be a stylistic choice. Some authors have done this really well, but it's probably going to be somewhat disjointed and all over the place. Again, maybe stream of consciousness, which if that's your thing, okay, if you can find a readership for that, great. But as I've said, I think most of us fall somewhere kind of in the middle of those two. I definitely do. So this brings us to the topic of today's video, which is the entry point. Something I also call the where does the reader come into the story? It's page 1, basically. Where are we within this narrative arc? Let's say we have, 3 acts, or just you can call them beginning, middle, and end. Start here on page 1. get to about the middle of the manuscript, and then we end. That's an extremely obviously pared down, simplified way to look at the narrative arc. But the opening, the where the reader is, I think of them as being dropped into the story. There's obviously things that have happened with these characters before the beginning of the story. I guess there could be exceptions to that, but I can't think of any off the top of my head. And there are things that are going to happen to these characters. So as a writer, something I am always cognizant of, but rarely, if ever, know when I actually begin a draft is, where is the reader going to come in? So that's really where my pantser tendencies come in, because I don't always know that. And if I think I do when first starting a new project, odds are that entry point, that starting point to this narrative is going to change by the time I get part way through the draft. So again, I'm about 30,000 words in, which is not, it's not a huge long draft yet. So I consider that to be for the type of fiction I am writing, which is just basically contemporary fiction. That's my thought with word count, is it's roughly a third of the way. I'm roughly a third of the way through to a finished, completed draft. Now, I haven't really focused too much on my entry point. I have just sort of let the story evolve pretty organically. And one of the things that's very typical of me as a writer is to just pick up kind of where I left off the day before, but also not to be afraid to jump around to later in the manuscript, something that happens in Act 3, or go back to something that happens in Act 1, or go back to the middle. I am not linear in that way. So that's what I mean, when I said that at the beginning of the video. I am very much I think of it as an intuitive drafter. So if something's coming to me that day, or I've had a revelation about a character or a character's motivation or a plot point, something that happens, I will probably start right with that, just so I can, more than anything, just pin it down, okay? And just make sure it's there in the draft document. I can always work with it later. I can move things around, which I do. But lately I have really, really been thinking about, where does the reader come into the story? Because at a certain point, what I also tend to find with every single project is, at some point you kind of need to know, because you're building your narrative sort of on that foundation of the point where the reader drops into the story. So more and more it's become a little bit of a pressing issue for me. And I want to use an example. It's not a book, but it is a TV show. It is one of, if not his newest, Taylor Sheridan's. He, of course, is responsible for Yellowstone and 1923 and 1883. I think I'm getting those right. I've only seen the Yellowstone series. I haven't watched the other ones yet, but I did start watching recently the Madison, which is, I'm not sure if it's his newest one, or if Dutton Ranch is the newest one, or if they've been happening simultaneously. I don't know. But I started watching the Madison, which came out, I think, not that long ago, a month or two ago. One of the things that I was struck by watching this, and I've only watched the first episode, so I am literally a viewer, not a reader, of course, because it's a show, but a viewer at the entry point of this entire world that's being created in this show. And I noticed some interesting to me, things. I was really paying attention, because when you come to a show fresh, not knowing a whole lot about it, I'd watched the trailer, I'd read a little bit, but I didn't want to come in with too many preconceived notions or expectations. Okay, so I wanted to come in pretty fresh, especially since it's sort of dovetailing with my emphasis right now on my own opening for my own manuscript. So I was watching this, it was sort of a keen eye toward what's the setup? Where does the reader come in? How are we first introduced to these characters and their world? This is no spoiler alert. Again, I've only watched episode 1, and I'll really only talk about the beginning here. I'll really focus on the beginning. I might talk about a few other things. So one thing that I notice is Sheridan's and I assume he has a team of writers, choice of characters with which to begin the narrative. The characters that are the focus of the the opening scene, which is a beautiful scene. Everything's just shot just beautifully up in Montana, and it's just gorgeous. As is anyone who's watched Yellowstone or part of Yellowstone, you know the cinematography, the settings are just spectacular. So very similar here with the Madison. The opening scene, and I could do a mini spoiler alert here, but I won't. But suffice it to say, the opening scene begins with a focus on characters who, while completely foundational to what unfolds, at least in this first episode, and I can assume throughout the series, are not actually primary characters, not main characters, okay? We meet the main characters very, very shortly after meeting the opening characters, but I just thought it was a really interesting choice. And if you have watched the Madison, I would love to hear what you thought about that choice in the comments. Because these characters are central. They are, you might consider them to be almost inciting characters for the rest of what happens, because what happens with these characters kind of causes the rest of the story to fall into place. It's hard to explain without totally giving it away, and I actually don't want to give that away, because if you are about to watch this, it's quite something what happens. So we're then introduced to the other part of this, family, basically grouping of people. Mainly, it's mostly a family, and instantly get into character motivation, and not just character motivation as in a single character or the main character, who I would venture to say is played by Michelle Pfeiffer. Again, just this one episode in, she was definitely the main character of this episode, but I can see that evolving, because what I've noticed with Taylor Sheridan and Yellowstone is that, yes, there are main characters, the main characters in the Dutton family, but with each episode, it was not unusual for a different character or set of characters to take center stage. And that is something that, as a writer, you can also choose to do, of course, with your chapters. You have your cast of characters, but I think some people think, well, I have my main character and they are always the focus. They always have the spotlight on them, which doesn't necessarily have to be true. You can absolutely sort of share that spotlight with different characters. You can do this either through multiple POV, point of view, which I have definitely done before. I did that in my book 100 Days. You can do it just through, if you have a more omniscient narrator and you don't necessarily want to change voice, multiple point of view is often best done using first person, although doesn't have to be, but the different voices can really come through strongly when you do that. If it's more of an omniscient third type point of view, then you can just have the narrator focus on a different character in different chapters. And that could be a really interesting way to go. So it remains to be seen what's going to happen there. And I think, again, getting back to where we come in as viewers, where we come into this story of the Madison is interesting, because I feel like room has been left open enough to allow any of these characters, and it's quite a sizable cast. I didn't feel overwhelmed by that. We don't have a lot of backstory on anyone except for, at this point, Michelle Pfeiffer, who, just as a side note, is amazing in this. She does a beautiful job. It's really great to see her. She's had a long and storied career. I first started watching Michelle Pfeiffer when I was a teenager, and she's still got it. She's amazing. Her acting skills are just even better, and wow, she's great. So everyone in this cast is great. Kurt Russell's wonderful. Like it's just a stellar cast. Those two are the main ones I know. Didn't really know the other actors, but they seem to be really well cast. And I can see, based on how this has opened, based on how the focus has been left as sort of what I consider to be sort of a wide bowl. So I can see, and I want to see more about each of these characters. So again, that comes down to choice. They could have chose a more zoomed in focus just on Michelle Pfeiffer and a little bit on Kurt Russell. And that wasn't the case here. She definitely stands in the forefront. If I think of a snapshot of these characters, for this episode, I would see her in the forefront, but I want to know now. It's sort of been a great teaser episode because I want to know more about each one of those characters. I wouldn't be surprised again if that happened. So that's another consideration with the where does the reader come in? How much are they going to be able to sample in those opening pages? So what do I mean by that? So again, in the Madison, we first think it's going to be a little sampler set in a pretty limited setting up in the wilds of Montana. We just have these two characters, and I'm thinking, okay, this will be interesting. We'll learn more about these two characters, but pretty quickly and dramatically things shift, and all of a sudden we're learning about more characters through different scene shifts, and then with this big inciting event that, again, I won't do a spoiler here. They all really come more fully into focus. So be thinking about that. I know with my current thoughts on the opening of my manuscript, I have just the main character. This main character is in a sort of an isolated situation. We don't have a lot of sense of other characters. So it's a little bit opposite of what Sheridan and his team have done with the first opening of the Madison, the first episode. So I think of really having that more hard focus on just the main character for quite a while, and other characters and other backstory details, let's say, that start to fill in the cast a little bit will come into play more gradually. So be thinking about that too. I like talking about a TV series or a movie or any kind of visual film or video when I'm talking about this in writing, because you can easily translate scenes to chapters. You can easily think of your story as being visual. They work really well together. So so other things you want to think about when it comes to the beginnings of things. Think about things like tone and mood. Something else I've done recently is I've read the opening to Belle Burden's memoir called Strangers, which is currently at the top of pretty much every chart. I mean, not fiction, obviously, because it's a memoir, but it's all over the place. Everyone is interviewing her, and this is a memoir of, I'm not giving anything away here. I haven't actually read the entire book yet, but the memoir of the collapse of her marriage during COVID on the East Coast, very wealthy family, sort of social. I'm getting a sense sort of socialized. I hadn't heard of her until this memoir came out, but she's kind of old money, and the end of the marriage came very suddenly and out of the blue, and that's pretty much what I know about it. But I did check out the opening chapter, and I thought, again, I'm not giving anything away because I've pretty much told you everything I know, and none of that is a spoiler because that's the premise of the entire memoir. What I notice is her choice of focus on nature, specifically these beautiful birds that are is it Martha's Vineyard? It's one of those East Coast islands. Hamptons, I think it's Martha's Vineyard. But she and her husband, every year came back and checked on these birds in the nest. I think they were herons. Again, I obviously didn't retain the details too much, but I was really intrigued by this idea of the focus, where we come in, what our eyes are first directed to when we come in. Anyone knows who's visited a museum or a theme park or any sort of visual place where the point is to have an experience that's largely visual. Anyone who's been there, which is probably most, if not all of us, will know that if you really sort of analyze how things have been put together, your eye is very intentionally focused on certain elements or a certain element. If you go to Disneyland, for example, I haven't been in years and years, but Disneyland, the Imagineers, I think they're called, are masters of this, in that when you first get in line to get on a ride, you're not even on the ride yet. You're first in line. An entire tone is set. I think of the Indiana Jones ride, where the second you get in line, you start to be immersed, not just visually, but by sounds, definitely by sights, and just this overall aura. For water rides, sometimes there's like this steaminess. I mean, it's sort of a multi-sensory experience. And that's a very intentional choice on the part of the ride designers, right? And it's really cool when it's immersive. As authors, I think we try to do this as much as possible. We try to immerse our readers using senses, but really all we have is the written word or the spoken word in terms of an audiobook. And so it's a challenge because we can't directly affect their senses. Talking about Disneyland again, when my kids were very little, we used to go over to California Adventure, and we would go on the Heimlich the Caterpillar ride. And it was just amazing. They would actually blast different scents, because anyone who remembers, was it A Bug's Life that I think Heimlich was in? And he ate everything. He's this German caterpillar, and he's huge, and he eats everything. But as you're going through munching the vanilla cookies, they're blasting the scent of vanilla cookies at you. I mean, it was really pretty cool. Pretty cool. And sorry, apologies if I got that wrong. My kids are in their 20s now, so I don't have my total retention of all of the details of every kid movie, but I think Heimlich was from A Bug's Life. But again, as writers, we really only have the written word, the spoken word in terms of an audiobook, but typically the written word is primary. And so we have to think about how we're going to do that, and really what senses are going to be primary. So again, in Belle Burden's memoir, I notice that it's very visual, the visual of these birds. And then she kind of brings in some other sensory details. You know, their galoshes are slurping down into the mud as she and her husband are sort of circling this nest from the ground, looking up. That was a lovely detail. And just it's a little chilly because I think it's spring or early summer. Again, I was more focused on just sort of the overall picture of how she's opening this. So be thinking about that as well. So sensory detail and voice. I will say with Belle Burden's memoir, there was sort of this foreboding feeling. And maybe it's because I knew just enough about the story, but I'm not sure. This is something I also tried to do in my novel, The Gilead. I wasn't planning on using this in this video, but I happen to have a pile of my old proof copies here. So this is when the book's about to come out, and you go through, real proofreading and making sure everything looks good. And I tried to do the same. I could actually see if I can go to the opening. This is a proof, but I think it is I think it's actually exact. This proof was late in the game, so it's exact to how the book actually is. I'm going to read the first paragraph. Was not planning on doing this, but I glanced over and my proof was there, and I'm talking about openings, and especially openings that have a sense of foreboding or sort of maybe this dark sense. And this is what I tried to do here. Okay. I have a quote, and I'm not going to read that. It's the talons that stop Gillian Kensington in her tracks, those bronze claws splayed open at jugular level and sharpened to gleamingly lifelike points, leave her in a momentary chilled trance, as if she's a mouse or a rabbit, or some doomed house cat just going about its business when it's snatched and lifted without warning, torn asunder in midair. So I think mine's actually a little more obviously foreboding than Belle Burden's. And again, hers is a memoir, this is fiction, but they're both narratives, right? So I don't know that it really, really matters. So I hope that's given you something to think about. Some of the different considerations that come into play. There are others, and I would love to hear from you about when you are starting a new manuscript, especially if it's a book-length manuscript, like a novel, a memoir, not so much a story collection, because that can be a little more disjointed because there are so many different beginnings, even if the stories are tied together in a story collection. If you are writing something a little more long form, what are some of the things that you find yourself, whether you're a plotter or a pantser, wherever you come in as the writer to starting to draft this, when you start to focus on the opening of the actual narrative, what are some of the things that you tend to have on your mind, or maybe that you have on your mind with your current project, or your most recently completed draft? What were some of the things that you really wanted to make sure you got right in those opening pages where the reader came in? So if you've made it this far, thanks so much. And it's been great to have you here. Great to talk about this. And again, leave a comment, like, subscribe, all that good stuff. And I will see you soon.